Streaming live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and blasttheradio.com, this is The Lowell Green Show. The number to call and be heard around the world is 613-413-2217. Or email Lowell at blasttheradio.com. And now, here is Lowell Green.
Oh, thank you, John. Enough discussion about COVID, okay? I think a lot of you will agree. So I am declaring this show today a national COVID-free zone.
Woo, yay!
Something entirely different. I don't know if it'll work. It depends on whether people take part or not. Grandparent stories. You know what? In 60 some odd years of broadcasting, I don't think I've ever tried this before. Your favorite grandparent story or memory, okay? Because in many cases, our grandparent stories they're a window into the kind of lifestyle that few people today could even possibly imagine. Now I'm going to start. It's my show, so I get to start with, I think, one of the most incredible stories, and it's a true story. Every single word of it is true. In fact, I'm really only sort of skirting around the outskirts of what this story really entails. My story centers around a New Year's tradition that existed in the Green family for many, many years. The tradition of eating rabbit, preferably jackrabbit, for New Year's dinner or New Year's Eve. So let me start the story. Long time ago, the spring of 1914. The World War I has not yet started, but it is certainly brewing. It breaks out in July of 1914. So it's early spring 1914. Henry and Mabel Green, my grandparents, excuse me, are sent to the tiny community, believe it or not, of Lowell, Saskatchewan, where they've been promised a fine farm and a fine home. Yeah, it's the same Rollo where many decades later, film crews showed up and shot the TV favorite show, Corner Gas. But I'm going to tell you, in 1914, there was no corner, there was no gas, and there sure as hell wasn't any film crew. My grandmother, Mabel Green, my 2-year-old father, Henry, or Gordon, as he becomes known, is in tow. He's about 2 years old at that time in 1914. And my grandmother, in addition to having my 2-year-old father in tow, she is 7 months pregnant. She heads west by herself aboard a colonist train. Now, I've got a brief description of this train from her. She remembers quite well. There would be a stove don't forget, this is early spring. It's very cold. A stove at the rear of every car, during which she would heat up milk for the baby. And she would sleep at night. They would lay boards across the backs of the seats, and lay boards across there, and then people would sleep on those boards. That's the way it was in 1912. She had to pay for that. She can't remember. I remember talking to her. She doesn't remember what she paid, but it wouldn't have been very much, maybe $1 or $2. After 3 days or thereabouts, she arrives in Rollo, expecting to find this really nice farm. Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, sorry, the old throat's giving out here. She expects to find a grand farmhouse, but it's not what she finds. What she finds instead is a filthy, what used to be, chicken house. Now, don't forget, she's got a 2-year-old and she's 7 months pregnant, all by herself. So what does she do? Well, as she said, I just set out, I started to clean. And knowing my grandmother, Mabel, I imagine that she did a hell of a job cleaning up that old chicken house. My grandfather, you wonder where he was. Well, he didn't have the money for the colonist train. be it $1 or 2 or 3 or whatever it was. He didn't have it. So he took a job, believe it or not, feeding and watering a boxcar load of horses. There would be about 4 horses in the boxcar with him. He had to sleep on the hay or straw or whatever it was along with the horses. His job was to feed and water the horses during the entire trip, which took about 4 days. Now, this is a lot tougher than it sounds because many of the streams and lakes on the way, particularly through northern Ontario, were still frozen. So they would stop the train. It was a predetermined places. Stop the train. My grandfather would get out and he had a fire axe. Down the slope he would go to a stream or lake, cut a hole in the ice with buckets, bring buckets of and horses drink a lot of water and lug those buckets of water up. And he would do this twice a day, okay, for 3 or 4 days to water the horses. That's how he paid his way. So he arrives in Rollo. Once again, I mean, obviously we didn't have cell phones in those days, didn't have phones for that matter. So he has no idea what he's confronted with, but it's a hell of a mess. But uh, his job is to, as quickly as possible. There was a team of horses there for them. Thank good. I think it was 3 horses that he had been left there. So he immediately sets to tilling the soil. Don't forget, this is Rollo, Saskatchewan, between Moose Jaw and Weyburn. It's in the middle of nowhere. Now today there's some settlements around. In those days, there were miles from any other settlement, miles from a neighbor for that matter. So he sets to work plowing while Mabel continues to clean the house and look after the baby. And in 2 months' time, my Aunt Genevieve is born. So now she's got 2 youngsters. So my grandfather spends most of the summer then plowing and planting and getting it. My grandmother is planting a vegetable garden because they need provisions for the winter, right? They got to, in those days you had to can, and she would preserves and so forth, but you had to get them out of the garden. You had to look after yourself. Well, that's bad enough. That's difficult enough. But in the fall, my grandfather breaks his leg. He is thus unable, and there's no doctor anywhere. So Mabel, young woman, young mother, does the best she can. She sets the leg, uses some wood and for splints and so forth, sets the leg, and by the way, does a hell of a job because, when he recovers, he doesn't even have a limp for the rest of his life. But he can't do any work. There's almost nothing he can do. So she has to set out to harvest whatever she can, get into the garden, do the whole thing, and look after 2 children. And so she realizes that they don't have enough provisions to get through the winter. 4 people, they got to feed 4 people during the winter. Doesn't have enough. She's afraid they're going to starve to death. But she has one skill. Well, she has many skills, but she has a skill that saved them. She is a very good shot. They have an old 22 rifle, which, by the way, was still around for many years. So during the summer, in a moment or two, there were prairie chickens everywhere. You could almost throw a rock up into the air and bring down a prairie chicken. So she shot a lot of prairie chickens, and they would salt them and preserve some of those for the winter. But primarily, and then in the winter, she shot jackrabbits. Thank God there were all kinds of jackrabbits, but she became very proficient and would go out, get a jackrabbit or 2, cook it up, and that would be the meal for the day pretty well. So she kept them alive the entire winter, shooting jackrabbits. It may not be typical of what our grandparents did, but it's fairly typical of what many people had to endure during those days. Certainly if you were settling in the West, that's what it was. So years later, come spring, by this time my grandfather is pretty well recovered. They get the hell out of Rollo, believe me. And so for many years, and by this time they're in Arthur, Ontario, which is where I spent a good part of my boyhood in Arthur, Ontario. Ever-growing family. They eventually had 8 children. And so every New Year's, the tradition would be we would have jackrabbit for either New Year's Eve dinner or more likely on New Year's Day. And how would we get the jackrabbit? Well, my Uncle Cecil was a very good shot. And he utilized me. Some time ago, John, I showed you my skill howling like a wolf. I,
Yes.
I had one of the few skills I had as a little boy was I could howl like a wolf.
It's very good. For those who missed it, it's very good.
So anyway, what would happen? Cecil was pretty smart. He went right behind our farmhouse was the railway track, and of course it was well plowed. So Cecil with the shotgun would walk down the railway track, and he'd send me around into the woods howling, oh! And the rabbits don't like wolves, and so they would come running out of the woods across the railway track.
Oh.
Bam! Uncle Cecil not having to, but I'm up to snow to my chest, okay? In some cases, probably up to my neck in snow, but I'm young and stupid and strong. So Cecil would, and we'd get 2 or 3 jackrabbits. Back we would come. My other 2 uncles, Willard and Orr, they had to clean the jackrabbit. I just basked in the glory of howling like the wolf. So for many, many years, this was a tradition in our house. It died off actually when my grandfather finally died at age 98, by the way. And for when I had to, as a father, as a young father, I tried to convince my 2 daughters that we should have rabbit for New Year's, but they would have nothing. There was no way because they had rabbits as pets, so there was no way we could have rabbit. I'm going to have duck. I'm going to try duck this year. I got some great recipes for duck. I'm going to try it. My wife's picking up a fresh duck today, apparently. But I think next year, if I'm still around, I think I'm going to go back to rabbit. You can still buy some rabbit. So there's my grandparents' story, folks. This is just the kind of life that many, years later, when my grandfather was in his 90s and still very sharp, and I sat down with him because I wrote some stories about him, and which, by the way, I actually got paid for in some cases, which is really the only way to go. But I said, Dad, because we all called him Dad. How did you do that? I mean, how could you do that? And like having to go down the hills and chop through the ice. And he looked at me surprised as if I was asking a silly question. And I'll never forget what he said. He said, "That's just what you had to do.
Yep.
That's just what you had to do." And they did. If you wanted to live, if you wanted to stay alive, that's what you had to do. There was no unemployment insurance. There was no welfare. If you lived in a remote area, there was no doctor, etc. So that's my story. And John, you've got a story, which I understand you want to. Do you want to tell us as well?
Sure.
But we're welcome, folks. If you've got some stories or memories that you'd like
Yeah.
to share, please. We've never tried this before. Let's see if it works. John, yours.
Well, I will save mine because I think we've got some great ones here from our listeners.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
Good.
and a text from Barry at 613-413-2217. He's right. He says, family stories are long and good to remember, so long as you're not talking about your mother-in-law. And I best be careful because I know that my mother-in-law listens and loves your show. Hello, Barb. Chrissy says, when I was a little girl and my granny Lillian were looking at white gooses, I was about 4. I remember it like yesterday. I started quacking at them and they took off after us. And my granny and I started running pretty fast. And she got me into my car seat so fast because I was scared. Yeah.
I think the appropriate word is geese. There's no such word as gooses.
I believe you're right.
Okay, but yeah, actually, that's interesting because geese. Well, some of you people have experienced this with Canada geese, particularly
nasty.
the males, the drakes. They can be quite vicious,
Yes.
and I think most farms had probably 1 or 2 drakes. Male geese out there that would chase you around, no question. John, you got
Yep.
somebody had a pet rooster. What's this?
Lillian had a pet rooster and slept on a hay bed for years, she says. Not a memory of her grandparents, but there you go. She had a pet rooster nonetheless. A lot of people commenting that your wolf howl is fantastic. Another person
Thank
saying
you.
it actually made their Google speaker react. So there you go.
Thank you.
Patricia says, my grandmother had 2 governesses. One insisted she do cursive writing one way. The other one insisted she do cursive writing another way. No one could read her writing. I took a letter to her so she could tell me what she'd written, and even she could not read her own handwriting.
Did she become a doctor?
Yeah, no kidding, right? Or someone who writes into the Lowell Green show often and makes me have to read it.
Grandparents' stories and memories. John, we got some more here.
Yeah, we do. Christy says New Year's Day at grandparents' farm, tradition was family dinner with goose or duck. They raised chickens for a living in Mount Hope, Ontario. Great memories of that, says Chrissy. Jules says New Year's Day, my grandfather insisted that we have spaghetti and meatballs. He would say the long noodles are the year ahead, and the meatballs was us rolling through life. I miss it. Nice. Lowell, my Google Nest just came to life when you howled. There's Terry on Twitch. Sam Ford says, my father's parents were deaf mute. We learned signing a bit, but was interesting to look back. And Craig is in to say, my grandfather set a campfire every night at the cottage where all the cousins, likely over 20 of us, would sing campfire songs. Even though we had many fires, some days he would burn twigs and leaves in an oil barrel. If you have ever been near one of these fires, you'd know the smell. Many years later, while I was digging footings for a new building north of Edmonton, an old fellow was burning twigs and leaves in an oil barrel nearby. It brought back such good old memories.
Memories of burning oil. Okay.
Burning oil. So my grandparents lived in Winnipeg, Lowell.
Yes.
And I grew up hearing stories of my dad talking about how he came home with a football injury. And his dad, who was military, would look at him and say, suck it up, son, suck it up, suck it up. No, but my shoulder really hurts, Dad. And his father would rub liniment oil on the injury for weeks until his friend and Air Force buddy, Dr. Sandy Watson, who used to be the head of the eye clinic.
Sandy, yes.
Yeah, yes. Sandy was my eye doctor. I used to go to him, and he'd, Jim, let me tell you stories about your this deep, beautiful voice. Scared the hell out of me. And, anyway, he knew the family. So he was over one night for dinner and took, take a look at the boy, if you would, please. He's saying his shoulder hurts. And Sandy has my dad take his shirt off. Dear God, Arnold, the boy's got a broken clavicle. Get him to the hospital now. My dad had broken his collarbone in 4 places.
Oh, really? And we're still...
So these are the stories I grew up with, not knowing my grandparents. One March break, I decide to fly out to Winnipeg. I need to meet these folks. And I get to Winnipeg right away, meet my grandmother. And, if you're going to cast somebody in the role of a grandmother, my grandmother, Rita Milkey, was that person. Redhead, beautiful cheeks, just happy. She and I got along great. My grandfather
got an apron, wears an apron. Yes.
Yep. Mrs. Claus, essentially, with red hair.
Okay.
And my grandfather, very, very quiet. The kind of man, exactly, as I was told, you don't get out of bed in the morning and go for a pee and expect to climb back into bed. Once you're up, you make the bed first, and then you go pee, and then you start your day.
Okay.
So barely a word was spoken. My grandfather finally one day says, boy, how would you like to go to the mall with your old granddad? Fantastic. Here we
go. How old were you at the time?
14, maybe.
Okay.
15.
So this is a big day. You're going out with Grandpa to the mall.
Yep. So we're driving down the Pembina Highway, and I'm looking over there, and I can see the football field. I was a Rough Rider fan. I knew he was a big Bombers fan. I said, oh, is that where the Bombers play football? He didn't even take his eyes off the road. He says, does that look like where the Bombers play football? Sir, yes, sir. Not a word was spoken, but I'm excited. We're going to the mall. I'm going to have such a great time finally getting to know my grandfather. We get to the Polo Park Plaza. My grandfather hands me a square piece of paper. It's got a quarter taped to it and his phone number written on it. He says, here, call me when you're done.
So what would he do? Go to do the pub
I have
or something?
No idea. Off doing his Kiwanis Club stuff or whatever the hell, but I didn't call him for hours because unbeknownst to them, there were 2 radio stations that operated out of Polo Park Plaza at the time, and I was this kid growing up, hell-bent on radio, so I spent the day hanging out at City FM, bugging them.
Did you ever spend the 25 cents?
Oh, yeah, I eventually called him, but I told the story to my uncle years later, who laughed and laughed and laughed, and he says, if that isn't my father. He says, I remember going out there for their 60th wedding anniversary. And at the time, my grandfather would have been 55, 56 years old. He says, I get up in the morning and there's Rita making up all the, bacon and eggs. And she says, Brian, how many pieces of bacon would you like? And Brian says, I'd like 3. And he says, my dad turns around and says, you'll have 1 and you'll like it. He says, and Mom, for the first time, he says, God love her. He says, for the first time ever, she turned to him and she snapped and she said, Arnold, the boy is 56 years old. If he wants 3 pieces of bacon, damn it, he can have 3 pieces of bacon. So those are my grandparents.
Oh, great. Good stories. I have to tell you a little story about my other grandfather. This is my mother's father, David Wainman. I spent 2 or 3 years living with them in Aurelia. Um, this was a very religious household, okay, and it was his first wife had died, and he was married to another woman who was very, very religious, and used to sing hymns in the morning in the most god awful voice you can possibly imagine. Oh, a shriek! She would wake me every morning singing. Anyway, but my grandfather David loved to read, and there was a lot of novels, racy sort of novels, okay? But very often the front cover would be pretty racy, like there'd be,
Mhm.
like bosom rippers and so forth.
Yep.
So he didn't. My aunt Lila never read, so he would take and he would rip the front cover off the book. Okay, so and she, so that she wouldn't see this picture of the bosoms or whatever it was. And so Aunt Lala once in a while would say, "Now, David, what are you reading?" "Oh," he says, "it's a Bible story," which is about as close to lying as he ever got. My grandma, I tell you, and I will move on, but my grandfather Wayman, I never heard him swear once. The closest he ever came, we were walking. I don't know what happened. He was putting the harness on the horse, and the horse kicked him. We're out in the barn, and the horse kicked him and knocked him right back. Boom! Hit him right in the chest. And he's got there. So there he is, and he's got the harness is sort of fallen all down him, and he's starting to, darn,
Darn.
darn. That's as close. Darn, he says he can hardly breathe. But anyway, that's grandparent stories. We have to get a story. It's not a story here about Shields. I told you they've got some great Boxing Week sales, folks. Check them out. Proudly serving Ottawa, the Valley since 1946. www.shields.ca says the website. And if you go to actually, electronics, mattresses, furniture, whatever, but if you go to appliances, what they specialize in, you're going to see a wonderful assortment there in stock. Which means now I can't guarantee that they could. I mean, we're getting close to New Year's now, but certainly there's not going to be a long delay. They'll have your appliance there when you want it, folks. Believe me. And if they tell you that it's going to be there on Thursday or Friday or whatever, that's when it will be. Prices, check the prices. You will see some great savings. Shields.ca. Not only that, you're dealing with local people. Good people. John, any more texts or anything coming in here? Anybody responding?
Yeah. Speaking of Shields, a friend of mine, Christine, sent me this last night. She had a friend on Facebook saying, "Fridge shopping sucks. No one has inventory. Really don't want to fix a 15-year-old fridge again." She says, "I've been hearing about this place on the Lowell Green Show, shields.ca." So they're spreading the word on behalf of your. I hope that works out. We'll follow up on that. I'm shopping in the new year for new furniture. Great. Thank you, says Lillian. Play stories, guys. Love it, says Mike. There you go. We're not getting any stories from folks other than the ones we've already heard, but they're enjoying the ones we're telling, apparently.
All right. I have to tell you a little story about myself as a grandparent.
Oh, okay.
Samantha, my granddaughter, my eldest granddaughter, is about 2. Very precocious little girl. And I don't remember all of the details. All I know is that I was in charge of her this afternoon, okay, after the show at CFRA. So because my wife's car has the baby seat, we changed cars. So I've got Debbie's car and she's got my car. So the baby seat is there, and I pull into the driveway here, and little Sam is sitting there in the baby seat. I go back. I have no idea how to unlock this damn thing. Okay, I have no idea. I'm fiddling around. I'm getting a little upset, and Sam she's 2, remember, just looks at me, pushes something. Okay, that's it. So that's fine. We've got her out. Then she says, "Papa, gotta go poo-poo." Gotta go poo-poo.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, "Now, honey, wait until we get into the house, okay? You know your toilet tray now." "Okay, Papa." Okay. So then I realized Debbie's got my car. She's got my keys. I don't have a key to get into my own house. So by this time she's getting pretty desperate. I said, "Oh my God, I got to get her in the house." So I smashed the front door, which is still smashed by the way, to get in. It's if you come in the front door, you'll see it doesn't work properly.
Is that why it doesn't close properly?
Yeah.
Oh, jeez.
Smashed it.
That's
So
great.
anyhow, I get there and I'm too late.
Oh, no.
Oh, it is not a pretty sight. Okay. Not a pretty sight. But anyhow, I grandparent through it, strip the clothes off or everything. I go into the bathroom, turn the shower on, set it on, standing there under the shower. She looks up at me. She looks down, looks up at me again. I look down. I haven't removed her socks. She's standing there in the shower with her socks on. So it's a story that that she has repeated many times to me, believe me. Yes. So isn't that a shame? That's what I was worried about. So we don't know. Nobody else has any story. That's too bad,
Joshua just saying, strong relationship with grandparents is so valuable for children's and maintaining old school
Yeah,
values.
but you know what? These are stories that I think should be shared.
I think in fairness, typing a story of your grandparents into a place like Facebook, etc., is more difficult. I wish people would pick up the phone and tell these stories.
Yep. Well, we got we're going to move on here. Oh, by the way, Leanne, who is Sam's mother, I guess just
she's laughing along. Yeah, she's laughing.
Yes, Sam and her socks. All right. Well, listen, folks, we're going to sign off a little early. Thank you all. We'll be back tomorrow.
Thanks, Lowell. This is awesome.
The Lowell Green Show is seen and heard live around the world at 2 p.m. Eastern. Connect with us online at blasttheradio.com/Lowell Green. Can't join us live? Download the Lowell Green podcast. Available on Apple, Spotify, Google, and more. Ask your smart speaker to play the Lowell Green podcast. This is a production of blasttheradio.com.